Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 7, John Locke. And our topic is consent, resistance and toleration. Government based on consent is fundamental principle of Locke's theory of political obligation. The idea of consent, however, is not properly explained and it remains one of the most vulnerable features of Locke's theory. John Lamont subjects it to the searching critic and comes to the conclusion that it serves no useful purpose. The notion of tech consent introduced to make the concept applicable to cases where express consent is wanting makes it all the more questionable and dispensable. As Plumney's brilliantly puts it, if you begin by assuming that only a consent creates a duty of obedience, you are only too ready to conclude that whatever creates that duty must be consent. We consent to obey by obeying. Obedience creates the obligation to obey. But this is absurd. John Donne also finds fault with the notions of consent as the basis of freedom in the state. The two treatises is an attempt to argue for limitations on the possible scope of political obligation. The notion of consent is a key term in the expository structure of this argument, but it is not a term which exerts any very precise control over the application of the argument to particular cases in the world. Its role is as a formal component of logical structure of the argument, not as a practical criteria of its applicability in particular cases. Consent is a necessary condition for the legitimacy of a political society, but the consent which creates such legitimacy is not a sufficient condition for the obligatory force of any particular act of authority in such a society. It is generally believed that Locke is above all an apologist of glorious revolution, perhaps the most conservative of all revolutions. As such, resistance or a right to rebellion, Locke seldom uses the word revolution, is an essential part of his political philosophy. A ruler who usurps power or forfeits the trust of the people and acts according to his own arbitrary will in contravention of the law of nature and against the good of the people has no legitimate authority to govern and can be removed, if necessary, by force. Government is dissolved also in case of conquest by a foreign power, in the event of assembly being prevented from meeting and deliberating by the prince, or on a dislocation of legislative authority. The dissolution of government, however, does not involve dissolution of society. As to who has to right of rebellion or resistance, Locke does not give a clear answer. Generally, it is only the majority which has a right to revolt. Though Locke was champion of revolutionary action, he was essentially a conservative by temperament. He was of the view that the revolution was to be resorted to only in extreme cases. According to Sabine, in spite of his insistence on right to revolutions, Locke was not a revolutionary. Many critics have held the view that Locke gives the right of revolution only to the aristocratic class, that is, the owners of the property. It seemed natural to him, as it seemed nearly to all his contemporaries, that the right to resist rulers who have abused their authority should, in practice, be confined to the educated and propertied class, to the section of the community alone capable of an intelligent and responsible judgment in such a matter. Ashcroft does not agree with this view and finds in Locke a more radical revolutionary spirit. In this connection, he notes the difference between the Locke and the Whig oligarchy, which was behind the Revolution of 1688. Resistance to tyranny is everyone's business, says Ashcroft, summing up Locke's views on the subject. Religious tolerance was a topic of great importance in Locke's time, and in consonance with his general philosophy and political theory, he placed greater emphasis on it. Conscience, he held, cannot be a subject of external control. A man is free to profess any religion he likes. The state should not in any case resort to religious persecution. It should not enforce practices relating to faith. However, Locke imposes certain limitations on religious tolerance. No opinion contrary to human society or to those moral rules which was necessary for the preservation of civil society are to be tolerated by the magistrate. Again, atheists should not be tolerated because promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though, but even in thought, dissolves all. Here we want to wind up this lecture and thank you so much for your attention.